Sitting in this magnificent theater, listening to the music or watching the movies was so important. What if it had become a parking lot? It would have been just an empty space. But it really served as the first catalyst, I think, in the rejuvenation of downtown Bristol.
Everything ebbs and flows and everything changes, but when times come, then the lights get dim here, wait for a new generation of believers, then magic happens again. That should be on the marquee every night. Magic happens here. And it does.
The Paramount, an iconic palace of entertainment that is as synonymous with the streetscape of downtown Bristol, Tennessee, and Virginia as virtually any other structure, save for perhaps the signature Bristol sign. While its marquee and lights have illuminated State Street for as long as most can remember, the Paramount wasn't the first building of note to occupy this site, and is just one of many theaters that have dotted our downtown blocks.
People probably know that Bristol was founded around the railway station, and Reverend James King was the man that owned the property, but he was not the one that ended up being the founder of the town. It was Joseph Anderson. In 1852, he started his business in his home in 1852, and lots were sold going about 4 blocks west of his house. And one of those lots happened to be the lot that we're sitting in right now at the Paramount Center. And that was owned first off by William F. Butler. William F. Butler was a very prestigious man. He was a worker. He built a hotel, and it was a 2-story hotel, which is a little unusual because all the other buildings immediately were 1-story or 1.5-story. And out of this lot, he built a hotel. It's called the Famous Hotel. It's one of 3 hotels that were started before the Civil War. Well, it wasn't long after that Wheeler Thomas came into town, and he bought the property, and it became the Thomas House. During the war, it became a hospital, but it was a hospital for civilians mostly. A block and a half east of here, there was a hospital for soldiers as they came in injured during the war, especially coming up from Tennessee. But this was a civilian hospital. And then it went back to being a hotel for a number of years. Most of the early theaters were theaters there for sideshows. And of course, the movie theaters, cinema, came a little later. So most of them had traveling musicians and very formal operettas and all that. So you had operetta groups and stage shows and dramas, and early cinema come from Baltimore, Boston, New York, and they came down. They especially traveled to Bristol because of the railroad. The road system was not good in the 20s and back, so a lot of them came by rail, and they came here, they came to Knoxville, they went to Chattanooga. This was their route. And so if you go to some of these theaters, there was the Isis and the Eagle, which is on the Virginia side, not far from the Paramount. Then you had Fairyland back in the 20s, and that was to the east of Paramount. A little later, not much, you had the Columbia Theater, And that was the high-end theater that was popular then. It had brass and is very established theater, very high-end. And so they had music troupes, and cinema came in early theater there. But it was around so long the building kind of got in such poor condition, and the rats took over the building, and it later is known as the Rat House, but I hate to call it that because it was such a high-end theater at the time. That's where you went prior to the Paramount coming in.
In 1879, W.W. Davis purchased the lot once occupied by the Thomas House for the sum of $2,300. With his home at the rear of the lot facing Shelby Street, he operated a family produce and poultry wholesale operation here until his death in 1925. Around 1930, Davis's heir sold the property for $120,000 to W.F. Daniel, who was a partner in a new business venture under the name of the Bristol Theater Corporation. Meanwhile, another series of entrepreneurial transactions continued to take shape in New York. Adolf Zucker arrived in New York City from Hungary in 1891. He started the successful Zucker's Novelty Fur Company in Chicago, but in 1903, he first became involved in the film industry when asked by a cousin for a small loan to invest in a chain of theaters. Together with other partners as the Automatic Vaudeville Company, they opened a penny arcade on 14th Street in New York City, with branches opening later in other major cities thanks to funding from Marcus Lowe, eventual founder of Lowe's Theaters, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM. By 1910, Zucker had become Lowe's partner in a theater circuit, but sold off his shares 2 years later to purchase the distribution rights for a French film starring Sarah Bernhardt. In 1912, the famous Players Film Company was established to distribute and produce this and other films featuring noted stage actors. He merged in 1916 with Jesse Lasky's Feature Play Company and another firm owned by Utah theater owner and film distributor W.W. Hodgkinson called Paramount Pictures Corporation. Incidentally, Hodgkinson's doodle of the Utah mountains inspired Paramount's logo that still exists today. This new entity operated as the famous Players Lasky Corporation, but continued to use the Paramount name for its distribution arm. Now one of the nation's largest motion picture production and distribution companies, Paramount introduced the practice of block booking, in which a theater who wanted a particular star's films had to also buy a year's worth of other Paramount productions. This led to a boycott by the rival First National Exhibition Circuit and their nearly 600 theaters. In response, Zucker began buying other theater chains to ensure distribution of his films, eventually leading to an FTC antitrust investigation. Throughout this time, Zucker was also building the subsidiary Publix Theater Corporation. 1926 saw the famous Players Lasky Corporation purchase a controlling interest in Chicago-based theater builders Balaban and Katz. Balaban and Katz had developed the Wonder Theater concept, and their houses were known for being the first to offer air conditioning. The next few years saw two additional name changes, first to Paramount famous Lasky Corporation in 1927, then in 1930 to the Paramount Publix Corporation. Birmingham, Alabama firm Meyer and Engvall represented Paramount Publix and its subsidiaries in Southern theater developments. In surveying potential sites for development, they identified the State Street property of W.W. Davis in Bristol as an ideal location for a theater. The Bristol Theater Corporation was founded with the new owner of the property, Bristol's W.F. Daniel, as vice president. Daniel leased the land to the corporation for a term of 51 years, and construction on Bristol's Paramount began in 1930. It was designed to have the latest technology available at the time, being one of the only 7 theaters in the country designed specifically for sound picture reproduction. It also featured heated and refrigerated air, murals based on Renaissance paintings found in ancient Italian playhouses, and enough plush opera-style chairs to seat 1,400 moviegoers. The lobby was the epitome of Art Deco style, bedecked in silver, gold, and mirrored finishes, topped off by immaculate lounges for both men and women. L.C. Fox, chief of Paramount Public Corporation's decoration department, personally supervised decoration of the building. A number of Bristol firms had a hand in construction, with Bristol Steel and Iron Works supplying and installing all of the structural steel, Leslie Sheet Metal Works with all of the tin, and Central Glass Company furnishing and installing all plate glass and mirrors. The total cost of construction, $210,000. At last, on February 20th, 1931, opening night had arrived. To greet guests as they approached the theater, the sign boasted 2-foot-tall letters spelling out Paramount, making it the largest theater sign in Tennessee outside of Nashville. Below the marquee proclaimed the occasion, Gala Opening, Tonight is the Night. The lobby doors opened at 8 o'clock as cashiers and uniformed ushers, all under the leadership of newly appointed manager Sam Suggs, welcomed the excited patrons and dignitaries, including Paramount Public's Division Director J.A. Corpel. At 8:30, Paramount organist Jean Van Arsdale began the ceremony with her rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. Following some opening remarks, an additional organ performance by Miss Van Arsdale, and a Paramount Sound newsreel, it was time for the night's feature, the world premiere of It Pays to Advertise, starring Carol Lombard and Norman Foster. Ticket prices of the time ran a healthy 50 cents for evening shows, 35 cents for a matinee, and 10 cents for children.
The Paramount was a step up. Now keep in mind, the Cameo was a national theater chain that came in, but the Paramount, well, of course the Paramount like today would be a very high-end name. Early on, it had a lot of the A-class movies that came through, especially the popular ones that started coming in, especially in the 40s, the Western theaters, and they had Western programs, and they had a lot of the early Western performers come in. This was always considered one of the Class A theaters. Kind of took over a little of the steam from the Cameo Theater and, of course, the Columbia, too.
The theater continued operation when, in 1944, a new manager would step into the role and would forever be linked with Paramount Bristol.
Well, he was a native of Knoxville, and he went to work at the Tennessee Theater in Knoxville as a young man. Because of an automobile accident, he was 4F and couldn't fight, which always bothered him. But he worked at the movie theater in Knoxville for a while, and that's where he met my mother, who also worked at the theater. And that was owned by the same company that owned the Paramount, and they were at some point transferred to Bristol. And so he was in charge of the entire operation of the theater, you know, and he worked noon to midnight every day of the week, just about. Sometimes he'd take a Sunday off, but it was a 7-day-a-week job. But he also liked the fact, I think, that he had relatively flexible hours, and that allowed him to be involved in the community because he was very active civically and politically in the county. If there was an organization Daddy wasn't in, I don't know about it. He was very involved in everything. He was a big Kiwanis guy. He was in JC's when he was younger, and Mom was in JSET's. He was on the Janie Hammett Home Board. He was just on everything that moved. The United Way, which was the United Fund, or the Community Fund. He was involved in everything, and of course he got involved in politics. He was a county commissioner, as you probably know, which he did that for a long time, and which meant he could marry people for some reason, and which he did that a few times. But just about any of the political stuff, you'd always find him involved in. In fact, in the hospital when he was dying, he was worried about who were they going to appoint to replace him on the county commission. That's just how involved he was. When I tell people that he was a municipal judge and a juvenile judge without a law degree, they are just flabbergasted, as I am to this day. that Tennessee law allowed that at that time. It doesn't anymore, I know, but because, like I say, his schedule was flexible, and so he was able to work it all out. The only disruptive thing I can remember was that he used to bring home some of his sad cases and put them on the couch for the night several times. and seemed like there were always policemen in our kitchen in the middle of the night getting warrants or whatever. So it was kind of crazy, but to my knowledge, he didn't have that much of a problem balancing it.
I grew up on Florida Avenue about a mile from here, so I walked to town a lot. And the Paramount was the center of town, as it is now. And I remember coming to movies here, Sunbeam Club, and it was just the place to go. It's where it was at.
You know, I grew up over on Kentucky Avenue, which is, you know, about 5 blocks from here. And me and my friends could walk downtown on the weekends or any days that there weren't school, and we were free to explore. And downtown back then to me was a wonderland.
We were still in the golden age of downtown Bristol. People shopped downtown. And you know, as I got older, when you were a little kid, you went and you spent the day at the theater, and but as you got older, you go down and you might catch a movie, but then you go up and down the street and shop the dress shops and the shoe shops and places like that, and it was a bustling place.
I guess I was 6 or older before we even got a TV. And then you only had 1 to 2 stations. We just didn't have anything to see. Movies was what we did.
One of the first shows, it was a variety show, and it seemed, as I recall, I was a kid, I don't remember how old, 10 or 11, sitting back there and the house was full, and it was a variety show with probably a comedian, and they had a unicyclist. And how he did it on this little stage, because it wasn't this big, it was probably about as big as 6-8 feet. And he came out on the high unicycle, and it impressed me. It looked pretty good on this stage. So I eventually did the unicycle and did the high unicycle.
When we were small, Saturday morning they had double features of cowboy movies and cartoons and such on, and you could get in if you saved the little round disc. At that time, it was Pine Mont Farms, and the little milk cartons, they were cartons and they were wax, and you had to cut out the little circle on the side. And you had to have so many circles in order to get in at the front gate out here at the ticket booth in order to get in for the double feature on Saturday. We came down here a lot.
Well, that was a pretty normal concept for movie theaters at that time. It was a way to get the children in, and of course, and a way to keep it open to them at an affordable price to have the special Saturday things. And of course, the parents loved it because they could dump the kids for all day Saturday and go off and shop or whatever. So.
The Paramount attracted kids, especially on Saturday, with their Coke shows, they call them. And you were allowed entry with 10 bottle caps. They needed to be Coca-Cola, of course.
It was free, other than the price or the requirement of the Coca-Cola bottling caps. And they had a stage show and a movie and a serial being a series of weekly episodes of probably science fiction movies or happy comedies and so forth. But it was a lot of fun. Depending on who was sponsoring the Saturday shows at the time, Coke caps or bread wrappers or whatever, Saturdays were a big deal, because the kids could get in for nothing, or pop caps or a nickel or whatever, and they'd get a couple of cereals, Western cereals, and then 1 or 2 feature movies. I suppose Coca-Cola was, of course, promoting their product and trying to see how many people drank Cokes, or at least came upon the bottle caps.
And back then you had the slide top bottle coolers in the stores, and they had bottle openers on them. So basically we would go around and talk them out of the bottle caps they already had, so that we didn't have to really collect 10 bottle caps over a period of time. They were glad to get rid of them, and we were glad to get into the Coke shows. And, it was like a big party in here. I mean, the kids were kind of going wild. They showed B movies and B westerns and and things of that nature. And it was a really good time.
And then often there was special entertainment like a talent show. That's my friends. Here's one of my friends performing at the Sunbeam Club, which Sunbeam was a sponsor at the time, and he's singing there.
I couldn't have been but 3 or 4, probably 4. And I remember my mother had a little blue dress on me, and my sister did my hair and put it up in curls because I had curly hair then. The only other thing I remember is I remember going up on the side of the stage, on this side over here, going up the steps. It was for that little Miss Sunbeam for the bread, for Heck's Bread. And they were doing this advertisement because, you know, they were putting all the billboards and everything out with the little Miss Sunbeam when she was advertising the bread. All I can remember is she told me, she said, you were entered the little Miss Sunbeam contest, and this was one of the trophies. I don't know what runner-up I was, but I've always kept the trophy. As we got older, we got to come down here all the time to the movies. When the 10 Commandments played, it must have been in the early 50s when it was here. But my mother let my nephew and myself, we out, and we came in to see the movie. But she told us, she said, now when the movie's over, you get out in front of the theater and I'll come back and pick you up. Well, we never did show up out the front. And she finally had to come in and get us, and we were explaining to her that this movie was like 4 hours long, and she said, you have to come home now.
I think I mainly remember certain movies. For instance, I came to see The House of Wax, which was a horror movie, with my mother. And I got so scared I wanted to leave. So we came out in the lobby, and I kept looking around the corner at the movie. And Mother said, come back here, you can't watch the movie if I can't. And to this day, I see that movie, I don't know, every 5 years on television. It's still about the scariest movie I've ever seen. I remember seeing movies like The Blob, which was another horror movie, and I look at those movies today and they're so silly and not scary.
Oh, I loved the musicals. They were my favorite. And of course, the 50s was the time of some of the great musicals, so I loved all that. I was not such a big fan of horror movies, which most of my friends really loved, but that was never my thing. And so I kind of stayed away when the Blob and stuff like that was on the screen.
And that was the thing to do on the weekend. If you had a date on Friday or Saturday night, you'd bring them to the Paramount. And I remember when I was dating my wife, my wife, they would always play the Elvis movies. And Elvis was a wonderful star and a wonderful singer, but his movies were distinctly, I just said, poor. They weren't. The acting was not real good in them, but he was a big name, so they made a lot of movies with Elvis, and they always played on the weekend when we were dating, and we had to bring our girlfriends to see this lousy movie.
We saw all the Elvis movies here. And when they played Blue Hawaii, when it first came to Bristol, they played it on Thanksgiving weekend. And my mother let us come down on Thanksgiving after lunch and come down and see the movie that day.
My cousin brought me, and we watched Shenandoah, and I cried. And that's the first experience I can, and I probably was about 10, 11, 12, I was young.
I remember we had Twerp Week in high school. That stood for the women are intended to pay or something, but anyway, the girls paid for our admission to the movies. And we came to see Shenandoah, which was a very moving and sad movie to me. I remember getting very emotional, and someone behind me said, "Sid's crying." So that stuck in my mind.
I came sometimes to the Coke shows, but I didn't really get into the Paramount until my high school years.
It seemed to me at one point that half the kids in the county had worked for him at the theater one time or another, maybe more. It was a first job for a lot of young people in the area.
I had a cousin that worked here all through, and she told me that I needed to go to the Paramount and get a job. And when I had to be 16, so the day I turned 16, I came to the Paramount and got an application and sat down here and filled it out. And then about 3 days later, I had a job.
Well, for some reason, I was never the cashier. I guess they didn't trust me with money. But I worked in the concession stand and sold candy and stuff and cleaned that infernal popcorn machine at night before we closed up. Greasy, nasty mess. I hated that.
My first job was in the concession stand. And the first thing I can remember is having to learn to pop popcorn in the machine. You had to have a certain amount of oil, a certain amount of, you had a big pull-out thing in the bottom of the concession stand, and you took it and put it up in, you put the oil first, then you put that in it, and you had to watch it closely and then reach up and dump it.
Yes, I think we all went through that same routine. We all did our stints at the concession stand.
I came down here and got a job when I was 15, which was legally the time when you could start working. And there was some kind of law involving being an usher here that I believe meant you were supposed to be in a position to earn tips. I never saw a tip as an usher, but they started me out at 65 cents an hour. And it was a really fun time.
First, they had the doorman that took the tickets and tore them, gave you the stub. And then the ushers, they had one at each door, and they had a flashlight, and they would take you to your seat.
And then there were ushers, and ushers really didn't do any ushering to speak of. They were, to me, kind of like junior cops. They just kind of kept an eye on things in the auditorium and shined a flashlight in your face if your behavior got out of hand. And I think those were the ushers were the ones that he really ran a lot of teenage boys through those positions.
There was a lot of camaraderie between all of us that worked here at the time. You know, when it wasn't busy, we would hang out at the concession stand and really just chat and have a good time.
And my brother may have been an usher. The ushers were usually boys, so he was probably an usher at one point, although he was more likely to have been the boy the ushers were trying to discipline, so, you know.
Everybody thought that was, and you know, that was the good part of being an usher. But they also had to clean, you know, every piece of paper, every popcorn cup somebody left. And the worst thing that the boys complained about was people sticking chewing gum on the back of the seats.
As ushers and later as a doorman, we had a lot of other jobs as well. We were basically the janitors in here. And there was a lot of cleaning up to do in this room right here after a movie, because everybody knows that you just leave your Cokes and your popcorn and everything on the floor when you're done. So we had to clean all that up, and we took care of the restrooms. We changed the marquee. I think somebody else basically changed the posters, because movie posters were and are very valuable. But it was a good time. It was a good time. We got to see, you know, a lot of the movie just from bringing people in and out all the time.
But mostly, you know, I figured that the box office was my best time. I enjoyed sitting there watching the people walk up and down the street and flirting with the boys that went down the street in a pretty car and good looking.
I worried about it a lot during high school, because when a guy would ask me out, I would wonder if it was just so he could get in the movie free or not. You know, I always suspected their motives. I
did have a couple dates here, but most of the time, if we had a date, we would go to the Cameo, because everybody else would be watching you. Judge Gillenwater was straight. I mean, he was, you thought he was really mean, but he was really a teddy bear. But you had to come dressed appropriately. And back then, you wore the same things you wore to school. You know, we weren't allowed to wear slacks. We had to wear skirts and sweaters, or, you know, but he came from the courthouse here every evening, and he'd come by the box office and speak to you, and then he'd go through the concession stand and speak to everybody, and then upstairs into his office.
Judge Gillenwater scared me to death. It was very unfounded. He was a very nice man, but I guess just being 15 years old and him being the boss, when he walked into the door, I just froze. But, you know, I know he was a very nice fella and did a lot of good things. But I guess it was just my age, and it was actually my first job ever. And the two assistant managers, Dave Peters and Carrie Fullwider, they were here most of the time. Yeah, it's pretty rare that we saw the judge, but when he walked in that front door, it just struck fear in me.
He did a lot in the office, more than with the Paramount. He had a lot of issues with young teenagers that were or children that were getting in trouble, and many of the night I would be up there and help him call to get somebody to come and take a child. He had different people that would take a child into their home and keep them overnight or 2 or 3 nights until he could find a place before they would be in a good place.
My husband tells a story of my dad giving him $25 and sending him down to the jail to bail out a kid that he had just sent to jail, because he got to thinking about it and felt bad about it. But he didn't want to go down there himself as the judge and bail him out. So he gave Wayne this money and told him to go bail him out. Wayne got down there with the money, and the kid says, "Who are you?" And Wayne said, "I'm the guy that's bailing you out. Don't ask any more questions."
He was the face of the Paramount. You'd see him in the lobby and at performances, at movies. But he was a good guy and meant a lot to the Paramount in downtown Bristol. His son and I were the same age. He's deceased now. His name was Kelso Gillenwater. So that may have caused me to know the judge a little bit better than I would have if I hadn't known his son.
I remember very clearly sitting around the dinner table at home after church one Sunday, and the phone rang, and Daddy went to answer it. And we heard his end of the conversation, but couldn't really make out what he was talking about. And he came back to the table, and he said, "Well, that was so-and-so," name I can't remember, the pastor of the Black Baptist Church. And he said he heard that we were opening the theater today to the black people, and he wanted to know if it was true so he could announce it to the congregation before they came down there and, you know, got in some kind of mess. And Daddy assured him, yes, it would be open to them and that he would be at the door to greet them and seat them. And this was an especially big deal because the Paramount had no balcony. The theaters that integrated during that era usually opened the balcony to the black people, but not the main floor. So at the Paramount, they were going to sit on the main floor with everybody else. But he opened the doors to them, and they came in, and there was never a single incident. Everything went smooth as silk. So that was kind of a high point. That was a big deal for him and for all of us.
They had a midnight movie a few times, and Judge Gillenwater sent us home, and Bob Stark was the police officer. He had to come in the cruiser and take us home because it was after 12 o'clock and it's after curfew. And Judge Gillenwater made each of us go with him.
The midnight shows were aimed at a younger crowd. You know, it was like Pink Floyd live at Pompeii, you know, the kind of stuff you'd want to see at midnight. And the crowds that came in were having a really good time. Occasionally you might hear a bottle roll down the floor from the back seats to the front, and they weren't Coke bottles. So we had to clean up after those shows, just like we had to clean up after the Coke shows. They can make a pretty good mess.
The main thing that always sticks out to me is his love of promotion. He loved thinking of ways to promote the various movies. And of course, that was in the heyday of movies there when I was a little girl, you know, so everybody got into all that. It was lots of fun. That's the one I always think of because I suffered the consequences for so long. But that was of course a circus movie. And so the first thing he did was had my mother make circus costumes for everybody on the staff, which was a huge job, as you can imagine. And I think he had a ringmaster outfit, and there were, I don't remember what all, but there were several clown outfits. And the kids in our family had to wear those clown outfits for Halloween for like 20 years. I ended up working full-time for Daddy for several months when The Sound of Music came through. The Paramount was one of the theaters that was selected for the roadshow venue. I'm not sure how they got selected for that because not all the theaters did it that way, but the Paramount did, which meant that there were only 2 showings a day, a matinee and an evening show, and you had to buy your tickets in advance. And because of that, Dad needed somebody to keep up with the ticket sales. And that was my job, and I sat up in the other office up there and answered the telephone from schools all over Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee, as well as individuals. I mean, it was an incredible outpouring of interest in that movie. We had thousands of people come to Bristol to see that movie. It just really captured everybody's imagination, and everybody wanted to see it, and most everybody wanted to see it more than once. So that kept us scrambling to keep the ticket sales straightened out, because even with a 1,200-seat theater, we'd fill that thing up fast.
I particularly remember coming to see The Sound of Music, which I remember costing $5 a person, which I thought was just outrageously expensive. My date left her pocketbook on the front seat of my car, and we came, of course, watched the movie, which was fabulous. Went back out, and the driver's side window of my car had been broken out, and her pocketbook was gone. I went upstairs to talk to Judge Gillenwater about it. Who else to talk to than a judge? And he told me what kind of offense that was and the likelihood that we would never find the pocketbook or who broke out my window. Well, that was that, except a couple of days later there was a picture in the Harold Courier taken from the 3rd floor of the Harold Courier building on Moore Street of a rooftop on the other side of the street with a pocketbook laying on it. And she saw it was her pocketbook, so we went to the Harold Courier and retrieved her pocketbook, minus what little bit of money might have been in it.
A lot of people never knew right back there on that back wall was a bell, and that's how we communicated with the projectionist. So we had certain codes that we'd tell him the volume needed to go up or down. Or the film was broke, things of that nature.
We were allowed to go up to the projection booth where the cameras were, and there was a big window there, and we could look out the big window and overlook the auditorium and see the screen and have a whole different perspective on things.
But at that time, the movies were on 2 projectors, and they had a reel that was about 20 minutes long. When it would end, it rings a bell up in the projectors. You can hear it if you're down there, but it's not very loud. But it just wakes him up if he's asleep. He's got to start the other projector. And then the same thing, and he's winding the film up on that one while the other one, and vice versa. When it ends, he's got to wind the other one. But that's the way it used to run. So that was his job. They always had to have a projector.
There were 2 that I remember. They were there for a long time, Henry Clardy and Hicks Horn. And they both worked there for many, many years. And I stayed in touch with Hicks, especially for many years after he left the theater. And they kind of kept me up on the news in Bristol and kept up with the family. They were like family to us.
Mr. Clardy, and he was just a gentleman, and he went. He just go through, and you know, he was friendly, but he was sad. He had a son get killed in Vietnam.
It was my first date. I took him to some function. I can't even remember what it was, but of course I knew him. We grew up together, and I needed a date for something, so I asked Jasper. Yeah, that was a very sad day when he died in Vietnam.
When urban renewal came through, it just zapped the life out of downtown. And some of those same contractors and business people, they kind of moved out. And that was the time that Bristol started losing a little population and maybe gave a little of its prestige to Johnson City.
I went to East Tennessee State in Johnson City, but I didn't really think about what was happening when the mall opened and the stores, a lot of stores moved to the mall from downtown. Parks Belt, J.C. Penney, who were big stores, and smaller retail establishments. And I'm sure the decline of downtown was gradual, but I do remember riding up and down State Street on occasion and counting the empty storefronts. And there were more empty storefronts on State Street, both sides of town, than there were occupied storefronts, which was sad.
By the 70s, downtown had just suffered a major loss, and the department stores were just about ready to head out at the time. The churches, we had 2 or 3 major churches downtown, either on or close to State Street. And they started moving their congregations down. That got, a lot of traffic out of downtown.
Well, it was really sad because a lot of the stores closed. Your major stores went out to the mall at that time, and all the shops and the theaters.
On October 4th, 1979, a meager audience of roughly 60 attended a showing of Beyond the Poseidon Adventure. Then, just short of 50 years since its opening, the Paramount closed its doors to moviegoers.
I remember that period, and the entire downtown was dead at that time. It's almost like when the theater closed, the downtown died.
It was really, really hard. It was hard on him. I mean, it was his whole life, and he didn't know what to do with himself. It was, we worried a lot about him. And of course, he worried about the building. It's funny, in a situation like that, and particularly as long as he'd been identified with a theater, I think half the people in town thought he owned it. So they didn't understand why it had to close, why he couldn't just keep it open. And he had a hard time explaining to them how that worked. But he was really concerned about the future of the building. I remember that, and I remember him telling me that there were people talking about trying to find a way to save it, and he hoped they could. But of course, he just died a couple of years after that, so he didn't. And I have to think that the theater closing had a lot to do with him dying at age 60, so too young to go.
In 1981, with the original 51-year lease expired, Harry Daniel, the property's owner and nephew of William F. Daniel, who had purchased the property in 1930, donated the building to a respected steward of the arts in Bristol.
My last movie here was with my 2 children, Mimi and Joe. And Joe had a big Pepsi-Cola in the middle of his knees watching Jaws. And when the shark came up over the back of the boat, Joe's legs went like that, and his Pepsi-Cola went all over. It was a mess.
I used to come here as a kid to watch films. I can remember seeing Jaws here. That's the one in particular I remember.
Well, I was very fortunate because I lived in Evanston, Illinois, where Northwestern University was. And they had the School of Speech there. And those students would go out into the community schools, and they would become the directors of the plays. There was a woman there named Rita Christ at Northwestern University, and a Mrs. Mitchell. That's all I knew her name to be. And they were doing a lot of studying about children's theater. And that was theater for children but by children. So it was unlike a child going to see an adult in a child's role. So we were kind of guinea pigs, and she offered a summer program, and I was 9, I guess, at the time that we went to Evanston, and I became involved, and it was a very good experience. But that really whet my appetite for theater. So when I went to Evanston High School, I continued in the choir and continued with the theater program. And then when I went to college, I was looking for a college that would offer a good theater program. And Sullins College in Bristol had a very good reputation for fine arts. They had wonderful music, they had wonderful ballet mistress, and they had a good theater department. So I got on the train in Chicago with 22 other girls, and we came to Bristol. And I cried for 2 weeks. I thought, this is so unlike Chicago or the suburbs, because I couldn't go outside the city limits. You couldn't go to unchaperoned parties. You were really very controlled. So my dad said, Mary Beth, just get busy, get involved, and you'll be just fine. And I did. And believe it or not, in the spring of my freshman year, I met a young man, and he had just graduated from Virginia Tech. And I met him and fell in love with him. So my idea and hopes for a future on the stage became a kind of a in the back of my mind. Maybe someday I can do something. Well, lo and behold, I had a little 18-month-old child, Mimi, several years later, and I met a woman named Kathy DeCaterina. She was a graduate of Juilliard. She had come back to Bristol. She knew a lot of Bristol people. She was very personable, presented beautifully, she had a beautiful voice. And some of her friends said, Kathy, why don't you take my child and try to help my child develop a little?
Dr. Fred Slaughter came to me and said, we want to write a book about the first 35 years of Theater Bristol and the Paramount, that relationship, that experience, and would you do that? And so we wrote a book, and we wrote the book Directing Confidence, Kathy DeCaterina's Theater Bristol. And because of writing that book, we learned the story of Kathy's own children. She had Diane, Frank, and Lynn. And Lynn had a little bit of struggle with confidence, and so Kathy had started a kindergarten in her basement. And with that, starting that kindergarten, they started to put on plays. And it helped the children gain confidence, and parents said, I want what you're doing for other children. And so that was kind of the impetus of Theater Bristol, was those early days.
I first met Kathy when I was still in high school. I had done a bit part in a play for the Dogwood Players, which was a community theater back then. And she had seen me in it, and along with David Browning, and approached me if I would be interested in doing something with the children's theater. Back then it wasn't Theater Bristol, it was the Bristol Children's Theater. And of course I was excited about it, and so I started doing some shows with the Bristol Children's Theater. Kathy was such a unique blend of a promoter, of an educator, of an artist. She had all of this stuff going for her, and she had such an energy and such a vision. Not just, I mean, obviously it poured into the Paramount eventually, but from the Bristol Children's Theater to Theater Bristol, some of the earliest education that I got about theater, about how to stand on stage, about how to project, about how to look at a character and try to develop it, how to interact with other characters. She just had the ability to bring that out of you. She had a great sense of humor, but it was just her energy. It was just her enthusiasm and her drive. I mean, you can't have an organization, you can't build an organization like Kathy built unless you have that drive. And sometimes it was very focused, it was very direct. But when I think of Kathy, I just think of her smile. That's what I think of probably as much as anything else.
She rehearsed in the Little Theater at Sullins, the Little Theater. They didn't have a big theater then. But then they built a humanities center. And so then the performances moved to the Humanities Center, which is no longer there. And she went a step further. Not only was she doing just children's plays, she was also doing musicals now. And at the same time, there was a group of adults doing the Dogwood Playhouse in Bristol. But the two kind of combined, and Kathy decided to call it, instead of the Children's Theater, it would be called Theater Bristol.
Kathy, had been doing that kindergarten in her home and, started this Bristol Children's Theater in 1965. And when she started that, they started just progressing and doing better, doing shows at the Humanities Center, and also struggling to find places to perform, and that was kind of known. They did some shows at Virginia, at the high school, and other locations. They struggled with places to find to rehearse. So there was a bit of a need, but also there was a lot of recognition of big shows like Tom Sawyer was a moment where they really moved forward in the quality and what they were doing, and it just exploded on the scene. People really wanted to be involved in what Theater Bristol was doing.
So her first show out of her basement with the children that she was working with was at Virginia Junior High School. And so I took Mimi, my daughter, to see that show, and it was Tom Sawyer. And it was wonderful. And so I went backstage and introduced myself to her and told her, I might get emotional anyhow, told her how much I enjoyed it and how thrilled I was to see that there were people who were interested in developing children to perform on the stage. I said, I'm available to do anything that you would like me to do. And so, as the years ensued, I kind of became the resident witch, and we did all the fairy tales, much fun. And the Paramount was empty at the time, and actually being used as a church. But Mr. Harry Daniels could have given this building, it was his, it was empty and not being used. He could have given it to a school, to a church, to the city, but he chose to give it to Kathy DeCaterina because she would take good care of it. She had worked very hard to develop this little Theater Bristol.
And then, of course, over the years, as I eventually came to work with the theater and literally was on staff for a while, it was really interesting because she would gradually give me a little bit more responsibility here. So even then, even at the point where I was working for her, the educational part of it didn't end. And I think it was really because she cared. I think she cared about the theater, but I think she cared about the people that she worked with. I think she cared about their development and their happiness and their joy and their families and all the things that make life, livable. It started out, I was just on a crew, but then eventually I became the producing director here. And my office was up there. And we had the theater, and of course, the desire was to be able to do shows here. I mean, it's a theater, and the Humanities Center was going to be closed. We knew that was coming. This was all sort of happening one after the other. It didn't close till after, of course, this opened.
And so when Mr. Daniels gave Kathy this building, it's wonderful. It's like giving somebody a 747. But you have to decide, do you have the money to buy the fuel to make the plane fly? So we were advised by several people that are fundraisers that it would be very important for us to have a feasibility study.
When it first started out, Kathy DeCaterina, who was the executive director for Theater Bristol, was trying to get some input from the community about how we're going to be able to do this. I used to give tours of the building. It was really kind of funny because the only way to turn the lights on was to go all the way across the catwalk in the top to the back of the theater upstairs, throw the power on with with the big lever, come back across through there, and then come down and give tours. And the plaster was falling off the ceilings, off the walls. At one point, I was directing a show, and we had rehearsals in the lobby. And so every day we'd come over here for rehearsal, and I'd sweep up some more plaster, and then we'd rehearse, and then the next day come back and sweep up some more plaster and rehearse. It literally was falling apart day by day, and it just wasn't feasible to use it as it was. It wasn't deep enough. Even if you took the screen out, I can remember walking around on that stage and thinking, no, you can't. There's nothing much you could do. Plus, you had no lights. There was no heat. It was in bad shape.
After all the interviews were done in the feasibility study, one name came out as particularly interested in this and Theatre Bristol, this being the Paramount, and it was Frank Leonard. Fortunately, there was a gentleman named Carl Moore who was a former state senator, and his daughter, Dana, and they had contacts in Nashville. And Carl said there was a possibility that they could get a match if we could raise $1 million. And that would make us one of 3 historic theaters in the state: the Orpheum in Memphis, the Tivoli in Chattanooga, now the Tennessee in Knoxville. But Bristol would have their own historic theater. So we talked with Frank, and Frank said, well, I'll have a party in the Paramount to introduce Governor Ned McWhorter to Upper East Tennessee. He was the man who wanted to run for governor from Nashville, but he had very little recognition. Tennessee is a long state. I remember one of the governors divided it into 3 sections. So in order for him to get some name recognition, it was good to have him up here. But in the meantime, we were told that Theatre Bristol would not be able to raise that much money.
But the long and short of it was that the organization that did the study said that they felt like that for fundraising, it would be much more important that this be considered a performing arts center for the community rather than just Theatre Bristol's home.
So we would have to have a not-for-profit foundation established. And we did. It was called the Paramount Foundation. And it was headed up by Frank Leonard. And they were wonderful. I would hate to leave anybody out, but we had the most wonderful board of directors.
I really think that probably Kathy had in mind all along that it would be a facility that other organizations could use. Certainly the idea of being home to Theatre Bristol was important to her, because that was, again, if you're part of the thing is trying to preserve your organization, you try to put everything in place that's going to help that happen. And so, but I think from the beginning she thought of it in terms of, yeah, Theatre Bristol will be here, but other places can use it. I think what really sort of not changed, but sort of shifted and made it very, I'm not going to say easy, but acceptable to have it be under the umbrella of the Paramount Foundation, was the fact that it was going to happen that way. When the feasibility study said that they felt like that the community would be more supportive of the effort to restore it if it was presented as a performing arts center for the community, as opposed to Theatre Bristol's theater that was going to be used by the community. It's a matter of perception for one thing, but I think ultimately it's also a matter of administration. But I think that the realization that that's what it was going to take to make it happen made it really, I would think from the way I remember Kathy's perspective, that was something that was going to make it happen, and so therefore she was going to be behind it. So I don't think it was that hard for her necessarily. If it was, I didn't see it. I saw her as very positive about making this thing happen.
Lee Shillitoe, who is no longer with us, headed up the fundraising committee, and he hired somebody to come in and raise the money. And the gentleman didn't think that was possible. So, I don't know, one day I was talking to Lee and I said, well, I think I could. Because my husband said, Mary Beth, $1 million is just 1,000 thousands. And that doesn't sound nearly as overwhelming as $1 million. And I am a cockeyed optimist anyhow, and I'm very persistent. Lee Shillitoe asked if I would be willing to try, and I said, you betcha, I will. And I had more fun. I opened up the door, I brought people in, begged them to come in. Oh, the most wonderful helpers, the wives of the doctors. A lot of the doctors had come to Bristol and found that it was maybe a little bit lacking in intellectual stimulation, perhaps, in the arts, because a lot of them came from big universities where there are orchestras and all sorts of theater and opportunities like that. A lot of them are musicians, as a matter of fact, and their wives came down and helped clean all we could for the big party for Mr. McWhorter. And we had a lovely party in the lobby. I got dry cleaning bags and covered the seats. As a kid, I remember going into one of our atmospheric, you know what an atmospheric theater is? It's one where you think you're sitting in a garden and the ceiling has lights like little twinkling stars. So it's as if you're outside and the stage is outside too. But I remember that when the lights would go down, it was as if there was a curtain that rippled that went across the big red curtain. And so I would come up here and say, now just imagine, the lights are about to go down. And I'd say, then the curtain will open. I'd run back, and I had found a film of Gene Kelly in Movie Palaces. It was thrilling because it talked about the Depression and how important these movie palaces were for the mood of getting people out of their depression. And sitting in this magnificent theater, listening to the music or watching the movies was so important. And we were kind of in a depression in Bristol at that time. So we did have them up there that night, and we talked from the stage about the potential of this, and all the doctors' wives had fixed a lovely spread, and Frank Leonard had underwritten the cost, and anyhow, I actually drove Ned McWhorter back to the airport that night, and he was a wonderful man, and he loved the theater, and he loved the people, and the people up here loved him too. So that's not how he became governor, but that might have helped him get a few votes up here. Anyhow, so McWhorter became the governor, and we got our $1 million match.
It meant a lot to her, and she wanted to see it come back. And they had a vision for it. And I think between Kathy's contacts and Frank DeCaterina's contacts, you know, he was working and interacting with all the businesses and getting sponsorships for the theater, and he thought he could raise that money. Mary Beth could raise that money. Kathy was out there raising money. They would get $60,000 here, $90,000 here. They got $1 million when they went, you know, and saw the governor. They pieced it all together, and they made it happen, and they raised all that money.
As all that was going on, one of the things we found out was in order to facilitate that fundraising, it'd be important to get the theater on the Register of Historic Places. And so that was when I got involved on that end of it, besides giving the tours and just, you know, trying not to fall through the ceiling, was going back and trying to do research and try to find the drawings of the building, find out who the architect was, and some of the things that were done in the 30s when the building was built. And then be able to take the architectural description of the building, put all that. There's a form that you have to fill out for the national. I think it's the Department of Interior that actually oversees the National Register, and give them all the information that they needed in order to make a determination that yes, in fact, this was a historic location.
And it's a lot of measurement, a lot of indication of what you're going to do with it, and the determination that you're going to do it historically correct.
That part of it was pretty much cut and dried. Once they saw that, once they knew that, for example, the Art Deco nature of the theater, and there just aren't that many places like this around. First of all, just from a historic standpoint, not even to get into the performing, you know, possibilities here, just the historic nature of the architecture of the building itself. And so it was a process, but it took some time, but it was pretty much straightforward. You know, there wasn't a lot of, you didn't have to dodge and figure out how to to fool anybody on anything or amplify the truth. The truth was plenty enough that people go, yeah, this is worth recognizing the fact that it has that historical value.
I think a lot of people think that means it can't ever be torn down. That isn't it. It just gives it the designation. But it was very important in the raising of funds. This building is important enough that it has been recognized by the government.
The original building itself had a very shallow stage. I can remember the silver screen that was in here when I used to give tours, and of course a lot of the seats were torn, and it was just an old movie theater, and it had been through, what I guess at that point, 50 years of use, and probably little restoration done over those 50 years. And also as a performing stage, it wasn't very, it was very narrow. And theater, of course, is the area that I have the greatest interest in, but dance or music or any use of that stage would have been difficult because of the lack of depth. So one of the first things they had to do was figure out what needed to be done in order to have that happen with the property.
We had a 12.5-foot stage depth, and it had the big sound speakers, no performance space at all. So if we wanted to become a performing space, we had to have a place to perform, and the dimensions were about 35 feet. So one of the professionals that we were able to have come down here was a fellow named Rodney Tiffin, I think, from Tiffin Scenic Studios in Tiffin, Ohio. And he came down here and he laid out this stage.
And one of the board members of the Paramount was an architect. And they made several designs, and they picked one. And it included, extending the backstage, because to make this theater serve a community theater, making sure there's wing space, backstage, that there would be fly space.
We also went to every union to check to make sure. I had these horror stories that I was the project manager. I picked up the phone and called everything that I knew to call. The hairdressers union, you had to have certain electrical outlets. I had to have little cubbies for each of the actors to use and a place for them to put their own lock on it. I had to have X number of toilets and X number of showers. You had to have X number of star dressing rooms and then gang dressing rooms. One of the things that a theater has is you have a roping system. But as a kid, I can remember being on the stage and I would see kids playing with the ropes, and it's a weighted system. And if you release one of those battens is apt to fall right on your head. So we didn't have room for the ropes, because when the dancer is doing her tour jeté in the wings, she would run into them. So ours are up a level, which is really wonderful for us, because we don't have to worry about that. And we've got a dock door, and we've got 2 floors upstairs for people to rehearse or dress or whatever. And it's a wonderful place.
So there's all these battens up there that to this day, we love designing a whole show and, flying the Wicked Witch and flying Glinda, because Kathy had the foresight to make sure all that was available. And it did reduce the number of seats in the space to give all that, but you can see that was so important at the time that they were able to do that.
It's 450 seats we had to remove, which was too bad. Then I did get comments, well, you've ruined it, because now you can never get anybody in here that you can pay for, because you need to have about 1,000 seats. So the total were 1,200 seats in the beginning, and we were only going to wind up with 750. But that was what we had to deal with. And really, it's wonderful, because one of our real obligations is to use this space for our community performance groups. These beautiful murals had all been overpainted. In other words, they had painted out everything that was detail, All they had were the figures. I was very fortunate because when we joined the League of Historic American Theaters and we had the ability to contact the people who had joined them as professionals, we invited a company called Conrad Schmidt, and they were the interior decorators. They had done the inside of the Waldorf Astoria. They had done the top of the church at Notre Dame in Indiana. They had a very good reputation. And they sent a man down here named Terry Grow. He has since gone into liturgical restoration. But I needed something to show people what it could look like. And when he showed me what it could look like, he did a painting for me, watercolor. And I got a canvas bag, and I took my canvas bag and made an appointment and went in, and I put my picture on the chair so I could look at them just as I'm looking at you. And I said, this is what we could have. And they'd look at that picture, and it was real. I mean, it really could have happened, and it really did. It was pledged money. We did corporate money. We did, of course, the businessmen all helped a great deal. But as for individuals, we sold chairs. We sold chairs for $1,000. One of the board members said it's got to be money up front. And I said, no, it's got to be pledged money. Because people like me, I couldn't hand you $1,000 at that time. But I could pledge it over a 3-year time. It's $300 over 3 years. A little bit more, but anyhow. So they decided that was all right. And that was your ticket also to come to opening night. Oh, and the organ.
You know, I'd play at church and play in many places, but you know, until 1978, I'd never heard a theater pipe organ. I just didn't know they existed. In 1978, I went to Tennessee Theater, sat on the front row balcony, because I heard that the most famous theater organist ever was going to do a concert, and they had a theater organ. So I thought, okay, I want to see what this is about. So, you know, just like with here, the lights went out, it got dark, the spotlight shined down into the hole, which I thought, wonder what's in there, and you know, you expect a dragon or what have you. And then came the bombastic heavy bass opening, and the organ rose from the pit, and I was hooked. You know, I was really hooked. So I got into learning show pieces and theater pieces and what have you, because I tell people, they say, well, what would you call hearing the Mighty Warlords of Paramount? I said, it's not a concert, it's not an event, it's not a show, it's an experience, because it's the only instrument I know of that has such a vast volume of sound and emotion. But the way these came about was, you know, in the 20s, when moving pictures came along, there was no sound whatsoever. So, you know, it wasn't much fun to go in and just watch characters do something. But when the theater organs came, they actually were called a unit orchestra. In other words, a one-man unit, one-man orchestra, because the theater organ was designed by Rudolph Wurlitzer and Robert Hope Jones. It was designed to reproduce the sound of every instrument in an orchestra. and that strings, reeds, brass, even the drums, percussions. So it was designed for that. So in the big cities, Radio City Music Hall, the Fox Atlanta, Alvis Kilby in Huntington, West Virginia, all of those were designed for a capable organist to come in and interpret what happened on screen with the audience. And the fact that those of us who are still living, who can still accompany a movie, who can manage the orchestra, interpret the emotions of the audience with the sounds of the organ, or use the sounds of the organ to crank up the emotions of the audience. We're all gone. Later on, years later, someone opened this to try to open it back up as a movie house, and it didn't work out. So, it was slated to be torn down. So whoever was in charge at that time, they gave what I call the organ. They gave the organ to Tennessee High School. Well, without the pipes and the workings and the blower, there was no organ. So the organ was given to Tennessee High. They were going to use it for graduation. A fellow named James Kiesling, who worked for the city's school board maintenance department, told me, he said, we couldn't find anywhere to plug it up. And there were no speakers. So, sad to say, he literally took me with him. When we were looking for the organ here at first, 1989 and 90, I went to Mary Lander because she was at King College and knew who Preston Spaulding was. And then I went to Tennessee High, got with the maintenance department, and he took me out here to a little road called Paperville Road out toward Holston Valley High School. And he said, I'll just show you. So I didn't know where we were going. And he stopped and he said, get out, walk around here. So we went around the truck and down this huge bank that used to be the Bristol City dump. It was just a hollow, kind of out here in the country. And in the early days, that was the Bristol City dump. He said, the last time I saw that organ, he said, we backed up here, and, he said, we shoved it off the truck, and he said, I saw it go head over heels to the bottom. But the workings, the pipes that were still here, see, Preston moved to Knoxville, and he also played some at Tennessee Theater. So some of the pipes from here, he did a rescue, and they're actually in the organ at Tennessee Theater. Still, some of them still being played. The word on the street was that they were going to try to restore the Paramount Center, and I don't know why. I think because I had been to Tennessee Theater and heard the organ and seen the theater there, I wanted to see. So I came up, went next door. Mary Beth Renero's office was upstairs. Are you going to have an organ? And she looked up and she said, organ, was there an organ? Is there an organ? Does there need to be an organ? And I said, well, there was an organ here. I said, I never saw it or heard it, but there was one here. And so she said, one of those things where you walk into it, she said, well, will you help us find one? So I'd already stepped in deeper than I thought I was going to.
I had overheard a conversation at a board meeting, and a gentleman was in the electronics business here, said the American Theater Organ Society can get you an organ.
That is a group of organists and theater owners who the goal is to try to rescue, restore, and keep the organs in the theaters. And we started looking, and we literally had, over a period of about maybe a year, because I checked with the Theater Organ Society. We got a monthly publication, and in the back, it had the list of all the associations in every area. So I started trying to contact them. We had 3 or 4 organs that would have been given to us. They were in defunct and closed theaters, New York, Michigan, long ways off, not playing. But Piedmont Theater Organ Society in Greensboro, North Carolina, when we contacted them, they said, talk about timing. This organ here originally was installed in the Paramount Theater in Charlottesville, Virginia, but in the 50s, the theater closed. And while it was closed, there was a fire. And nothing as far as all of the equipment, the pipes and equipment in the chambers, which is really what the organ is. This is called the key desk, the console or the key desk, where all the keys and stops are. But the original key desk to this, it perished in the fire. It completely burned. So this one is a Wurlitzer organ works with a Kimball organ console. This organ was actually, it was built about 1925 and 6. The original, it's a Mighty Wurlitzer 3 manual, which means 3 keyboards, 16 rank. A rank is a whole set of pipes that are one voice only. It actually is capable of reproducing the sounds of a full orchestra. And by the way, none of this is digital. None of this comes through a speaker. It is all, what you hear is the instrument. Some of them are mounted to the walls with the actions, all the hammers and whatever in front of them. But they're all real instruments played from the console. When Charlottesville, the fire, after all that, the organ was brought out. An individual bought it just for a short while. I think he decided it was too much to reinstall. So it went to Elon College, and they installed it in a building that was like Music and Fine Arts building. But one day they decided, we're not going to do organ students any longer. This building's going to be renovated. PTOS knew we were looking for an organ. We got a phone call and said, I think it was on Tuesday, we got a phone call and it said, Elon is completely gutting the inside of this particular building to do a complete renovation. The organ's going out. If it's not out by Saturday night, Tuesday, Saturday, if it's not out by Saturday night, it's going to the scrap. It's going to the scrap pile. So we rousted people together. James Repass, who's passed away now, we rousted a group of people, rented 2 tractor trailers, and went to Elon, North Carolina, went to the college, and brought everything back. There were, there's over 200,000 pieces of equipment. When you get into every mechanical piece that works and all that, all of the pieces had to be kept together, and so that as we went through, because everything in it we completely restored. And we showed him how, and there were some other people that did help him, but they weren't there every day. He was just relentless because he so wanted, his words, I've got to live long enough to see this organ played. Of course, we did a lot of publicity. The console sat in the front window so everybody that went by could see it sitting there. In 1989 and 1990, we got it to where it was playable, and only half of it worked. But half of it was enough to get music. And then after another year, we finally got everything working.
We were worried we can't excavate here because Bristol is full of caverns. So how were we going to get the organ up and down? Where was it going to sit? I had been to the Alabama Theater in Birmingham, and their organ is permanent on the stage. So if you had a performance up here, you would have a hard time seeing over that organ. And all of a sudden I was in Ohio, and there was the scissors lift. Anyhow, and I said, wow, I bet we could use that.
Lloyd Smith was the chief engineer for Line Power. He and Frank Linder worked together. But anyway, Lloyd took all the measurements for the console and the weight, and he actually designed this lift. My grandfather and uncles were all from Saltville, Virginia. He did not want them to spend their entire life in Saltville, Virginia in a salt mine because that's what everybody did. So they wanted to come to Bristol. This was about 1925. So they came down. My dad told me that when he was 7 or 8 years old, Mammy would make 8 or 10 sandwiches and put them in a sack. And he said I would come down to the Paramount at lunchtime and find them and bring them their lunch. If you look over the doorways back here at the Art Deco work, the design work, and then out in the lobby as you come up toward the entry doors here, all of the cornice work, my grandfather was a breeze at doing that. When this was closed, Theater Bristol was starting to try to just come in and let's just see what we've got to work with. I started with the scenes on the wall. They had been covered with pegboard, 1 foot squares of pegboard, soundboard. So I came in, but I brought my dad down here one day with me. And he just started talking about it. He said, come out here a minute. So we went into the lobby, and he said, you see that up there? He said, we called him Pappy, my grandfather. He said, I helped Pappy. He said, I helped Pappy put every piece of that up there. And I said, when were you ever in here? He said, Mammy would fix sandwiches, and he said, I brought him to lunch every day, and he said, I come down here many a time, and he'd say, here, he called him boy, here, boy, you can get up this ladder easier than I can, go up there and hold that for me. But it was interesting, and kind of sad, too, that I wasn't to come in here. They worked here, but once it was open. But, back in the early days, in the early days of movies, in the 30s, Hollywood was looked down upon by religion. Back then, God forbid, if you'd have shown a shoulder, that'd be grounds to just close the place down. I just was not allowed to come in. And I said, I kid people, I say, you hear that spinning sound? Listen, it's over this way. You hear the spinning sound? That's my grandfather spinning in his grave because, I'm the house organist here for 30 years. And I hate that he never, and another one, my dad never got to hear me play. No, he never got to hear me play here.
So we've got the organ, which I always refer to as the icing on the topping of the cake. Who was going to be, what was opening night? What was it going to be? Well, we decided Tennessee Ernie Ford was the person we wanted to get.
Ernie and my mother grew up on Windsor Avenue. When my dad was 17, he moved to Bristol from Michigan, and his family moved to Windsor Avenue. And the story is that he introduced my dad to my mother, and they were married. And Ernie remained friends with my parents his entire life. When Ernie came to Bristol for the reopening of the Paramount in '91, he called me the day before the function and wanted to know if we could meet down here so he could see the Paramount. We walked through the theater, he walked on the stage, looked around, talked to some people. We walked out of here and took a right and started walking up the street, at which time some photographer for the Herald Courier took a photograph of us walking up the street. I haven't seen that photograph in a long time. During that walk, I said, Ernie, what are you going to sing tonight? And he said, 16 tons. I said, oh, that's great. Everybody loves 16 tons. What else you going to sing? He said, that's it. I said, now, I mean, what other songs are you going to sing? He said, I'm only going to sing 16 tons. Well, I mustered up what it took to challenge Ernie Ford, and I said, You know, people are paying a lot of money to come to this event. They're going to expect a whole lot more than one song. He said, trust me, it's going to be fine. And it was. He and Lloyd Wells, who was a classical guitarist from Nashville, were on the stage. Lloyd played a few bars, Ernie sang a few bars, and Ernie would stop and he'd tell a story. Then he'd sing a few more bars, and it took him about an hour and a half to sing 16 tons, but it was fabulous. Everyone was laughing, he was laughing, cutting up, having a good time, so he was right and I was wrong. All he needed to sing was one song.
Funny story. I came from Chicago. I didn't know anything about country music. I'm still not very educated in country music, but I just haven't had time right this minute, but I will do that sometime. But this one gentleman's name was Bob Stuart, and he sold Hanes pantyhose. And he was real nice, but he traveled to Atlanta. And he said he just happened to be turning on the television. It was broadcast live. And he said, he kind of blinked his eyes twice, and he said, who is that introducing Tennessee Ernie Ford? He said, it was me. He said, oh my gosh.
This is Mary Beth Renero. Mary Beth, welcome to our show.
Yes.
We're looking at pictures of the renovation here, right?
That's right. It has been a total renovation.
Where'd you get the money for all this?
We got it from the community.
Yes, and it's marvelous.
I did love Tennessee Ernie Ford. He was so nice. He was so nice. Opening night was very exciting. People dressed in tuxedos. The auditorium was totally full. And Tennessee Ernie Ford came, and it was wonderful. And we had less than 5% failure to pay the pledge. So, you know, I thought that was quite amazing. I don't know how that goes in fundraising, but I thought it was pretty neat because the community wanted it. They realized the potential for it.
So that's what happened. And then they opened the stage, and the first Theater Bristol show was one they had been doing, Pump Boys and Dinettes on this stage. And then ever since then, this was the home theater for Theater Bristol to come and do shows. She was absolutely thrilled. You know, this was just, I think she felt that she had secured the future for Theater Bristol.
I have performed on the stage and have directed some shows that were performed here. And there's a sense of real excitement about being able to do a show in a facility like this. You know, any theater has its allure as a theater. This place has got such, again, it's a beautiful showplace. I was on tour about 10 years ago, and it was a national tour, and we were in 39 states, a lot of different theaters. There's no place prettier than here. There are bigger theaters, there are smaller theaters, but there's no place prettier. I don't feel any more ownership of it than anybody else, but I do feel like that I'm proud of the involvement that I had in trying to get the theater restored and get it up and running. And other people did much more than I did. But the little part that I played makes me feel proud.
My dream of being on the stage, I have been on the stage. In fact, I chose where they put the traps on this stage because I dreamed one day I would be the Wicked Witch of the West. And I have been twice. So I went down the traps that I wanted to go down. Anyhow, I've had 3 wonderful children and 7 wonderful grandchildren. And my children have all been on the stage with me. I have had a wonderful life.
I came to Bristol in 1990, in September of 1990, and found this to be a wonderful place. We knew we would stay here and retire here. And shortly after I came, someone invited me to go over to the Paramount. It was under construction, and beautiful place. And I think it was Rick McVeigh who ended up being an outstanding actor at Barter Theater. And I think Mary Beth Renero was here to show me around. From there, a few months later, they had the grand opening. And I remember that it was a big event in town, that everybody was excited about it, except I really didn't know anybody, and I got invited, and I didn't go. And I hate to admit that, but I didn't go. And I've regretted it ever since. Right after that, a person, Frank Leonard, came to me, and first time I met Frank, and he said, I want you to serve on the board of the Paramount. And so I accepted, not knowing what that meant even. The first meeting, I walk in, and Frank says, well, I've got some news for you, that we don't have any money. We've got a $225,000 debt, and that number might not be exact, but it's what I remember. And so I said, whoa, what have I gotten myself into? And we struggled. We hired several directors. They didn't last very long, a year or so at a time. And then we hired an old friend to all of us, Harry Scanlon, and he stuck around for the next 15 years.
It started a long time ago. I was vice president for advancement at King College. We changed presidents through retirement. The new president wanted his own team, as it happens, I think, at every institution that changes presidents. So I was fired from my job. And because of Rotary and some other things, there were a lot of folks that knew me. You ought to come down to the Paramount and raise money. We need to raise $585,000. Pay off the debt, hire a marketing director, and have money for programming. And I thought about it a while and decided that sounded like a good idea. And so that's how I got started. I was the third executive director. There was a man from New York. His name was Peter. I don't remember his last name. Doris Sinks was in next, and I built on some of what they did. After I became executive director, Joe Macione was board chair at the time. We're standing in aisle 1 over there. And he looks at me one day and says, tell me what you like about this theater. And I'm running on about all the good things it is, and we didn't tear it down and make 36 parking spots. And after I stopped talking, he said, tell me you can't run this building. And I was hung with my own words. And we had a press conference here on the stage, and that started it. And a lot of it was learned by doing. I don't sing, I don't dance, I don't act. I had no theater management background. So I was perfect for the job. And a lot of it was learned by doing. An example, my first show was Doyle Lawson and the Bluegrass Show. And I had no idea. I had the thermostat set at 72. When you fill this theater up with warm bodies, it takes the temperature up. So it was up to 76, and people were fanning themselves. So I learned. Set it at 68, and it'll come up to 72. That's just one example of some of the things that went on around here.
They had just gone through construction, and the community stepped up for the construction. And it was not a good time to raise money because we were going right on the heels of between the state of Tennessee and the people locally. They had contributed a good bit of money, and so you don't go out and say right after that, well, we need money now to operate, but we did, and it was a struggle.
But the community raised the money to match the state of Tennessee $1 million grant, and it came from everybody. The school kids had pennies for the Paramount, so there was contributions from all sorts of our community. And it was my idea this theater belongs to the whole community, so we should have something for everybody entertainment-wise. There was no habit of looking to the Paramount for entertainment, so we were beginning from the very bottom. Dave Vaught comes to mind. He did magic shows here, $1 for the young person, $2 for the adult. So a family of 5 could come for $20 and still go to McDonald's. The East Tennessee Children's Choir wanted a place to play. 4th, 5th, and 6th graders who were extraordinary talents musically, and we put them on stage. You just tried to do a little of this and a little of that. Tennessee High Madrigals were here. The ballet, the Bristol Concert Choir, this was a home for them. So gradually it built.
I started playing guitar when I was 10 years old, and it stuck. I just loved it. So I went from there to playing with a group that my idol was playing with, the Kenny Athey, out of Clarksburg, Virginia, a group called the Rockets. And I wasn't even old enough to get in places where they played, but my parents let him take me, and he'd sit me beside him and say, "Don't move, just watch." So that's pretty much how I learned. And then I left and went on the cruise ships. The Magic took me there. So then they found out I could do guitar work and started working with the orchestra some with some guests that was on the cruise ships. And so then I came off of there and joined the Union out of Nashville and started touring with some bigger names, a little bit better pay. And so God's been good to me. I've been able to do a lot of things that most people wouldn't be able to. My uncle taught me some card tricks, and I thought he had been away to college because I hadn't seen him in about a year. And then later I found out he had been in prison for a year, and that's where he learned the card tricks. So but and that stuck too. Well, once he taught me everything he knew, he took me to a public library over in Saltville, Virginia, and I started checking out magic books. And in the back of those books were addresses to magic shops all over the United States. So I started writing to them. They send me the catalogs, and started building the show from that. Back then, it was really hard to get anybody to share anything with you. They were so secretive. And back then, some of the instructions that you got in the mail were written in code. So you had to spend the extra $5 to decipher the code so you could understand what they were talking about. So we started touring then, and we visited 32 states and doing magic in all the states, and just setting up and tearing down, doing shows and loading back and traveling again. And I loved it back then, you know. I wouldn't change a thing. I don't want to do it now, but I wouldn't change a thing. But I got to tell you this is the honest truth about, we've been in so many theaters throughout the United States, and there's none any better than this one. And what I mean by that, there's some great theaters all over the United States, and they're very good. But most of the time, there's one element that's missing. You go there, and the sound system is not exactly right. The audience their auditorium is wonderful. The lighting's good, but the sound system's not right. Or vice versa, the lighting's not really good. You know, there's one element. Here, every element from the time you unload is right. The loading area is perfect. Plenty of wing space. We used to do illusions on a motorcycle, and it had its small bedroom, but we had wing space to put it here out of sight until we needed it. You know, the stage is perfect. The teaser curtains are perfect. The fly system, perfect. You know, the acoustics are great. The sound is great. The lights are great. And I like the auditorium, the smaller one, better, like this. We've been in some huge auditoriums, and you can only play and connect so far back. And you hope the rest of them will join you as they can. But here, you can connect with every person in the audience. There's not a bad seat in the house, and you can connect with one all the way back in the back. And that's what I like. It's more personal. I get personal with my illusions and the tricks that we're doing, get a lot of people involved up on stage with us. So that's a wonderful thing, too.
I've played crowds of every size, but there's something about, you know, going back to country music, the roots of country music, it's about the stories. It's about songs that tell stories so many times. And that can get lost in a grand atmosphere of a stadium or a coliseum or even an amphitheater. But when you put it into a setting like this, you can do songs that tell stories and touch people's hearts. But it works both ways, because when it touches their hearts, it touches our hearts too. So Everybody wins in a theater like this when everything's right.
Comedy is a very intimate form of entertainment. Your audience has to be engaged and involved in the show in the sense of when you're in an arena, there's a lot of people, but somebody's watching it on a screen. You know, in a theater like this, you're there. You're part of the show, as I say. You know, it's so much more fun for the audience and for the performer when they know the audience is engaged. And it's hard to get engaged when there's 20,000 people as opposed to 1,000 people or 1,500 or whatever. In a theater like this, the great thing is that there's not a bad seat in the house. You know, whether you're sitting in the very back row or you're on the front row, it's that size theater that you're still with, you know, in that engagement era of the show.
I've been very fortunate to get to play some larger places, and that has its benefits, and that's an incredible thing for sure. That, strictly speaking, means the number of people that would like to see you is a large number. The great artists, I think, are the ones that can take those large places and make them feel small. Whether it's like a Garth Brooks is playing a stadium, but he has the ability to have that connection in that place. But what you're all aiming for is the type of connection that actually exists in a room like this. It can get unwieldy in those larger places, and you can lose attention. The people are, you know, eating their nachos or off, you know, looking at their phone or thing. That can happen. That's why you're working real hard to sort of bring it right to where we are here. I swear this place, you can just hear right now from the stage, the acoustics. We will be amplified, I promise, but I'm not sure we'd need it. I feel like we could sit right there on the edge of that stage with our two guitars, my friend Colin and I, and we could have that connection.
We didn't have television growing up, so the only thing I had was radio and records, and I, you know, just immersed myself into that. Of course, his family, my dad's family, is big into the bluegrass thing, but it was something I actually discovered later on in life. I was in my early 20s when I started playing the mandolin, so I started following bluegrass more extensively at that point, obviously. So, but that family love for music has always been there, and that's kind of where my love for it came from. I have worked with a couple of friends of mine in a variety of bands over the years, Kevin Jackson and Rick Barker, and we've had a variety of forms of bluegrass bands. Wallace Switch, our current band is North Fork, but those guys also playing with Tim White and the guys from Troublesome Hollow through the years, which has led to many of the performances here at the Paramount Theater because of the Leon Kaiser Memorial Scholarship Fund that benefits the ETSU Bluegrass Music Program. Was one of the biggies that featured local artists and gave them a chance to play on the stage. We only got 2 songs, but when you have 30 bands in one night, you know, but it does get you an exposure to playing on this wonderful stage, and the acoustics here are just so wonderful. The audience is, it's an intimate setting, and you really feel connected to them, and I think that's why performers love playing here so much.
My hero, Chet Atkins, when I came here to see him, and I had no idea. Harry Scanlon was here at the time, and I had no idea that Chet did magic, but he did card tricks, and so Harris wanted to come on backstage, so we did some card tricks backstage before the show, so that was great. But seeing Chet as elegant as he is and such a dry sense of humor, what a wonderful show. Of course, the Nutcracker, because believe it or not, they asked me, because of being a magician, I guess, they asked me to do Drosselmeyer at one time, so I did that, and that was a lot of fun.
Actually, the first time I played here at the Paramount was the 50th anniversary of Farm and Fun Time, which was in 1996, as I recall. And the thing that stands out about that, I play a Ray Deerstone mandolin, And he just had finished it up, and he said, "Hey, I hear you're playing at the Paramount for Farm and Fun Time, and I want to know if you want me to bring that mandolin for you to play." So it was the first time. So it has a special day memories for me. Dr. Ralph Stanley was here, Ricky Skaggs. I was able to be a part of a band that paid tribute to Flat and Scruggs with Tim White, Richard Bennett, the late great Kenny Baker and Josh Graves, and also Alan Mills from Lost and Found. And then we also backed Mac Wiseman that day, who was a part of the original Farm and Fun Time, and we were actually his band. So it was like I was thrown to the wolves the first time I played here, and I was surrounded by these wonderful musicians and heroes of mine.
I introduced several acts because I became president of the board here, and through that we get asked to introduce acts. A group came to me, and they were one of the forerunners of the Birthplace of Country Music Museum, and so we sponsored Farm and Fun Time anniversary. It was in 1996, I believe. I got to introduce the show, and we had some country music stars, well, bluegrass stars at the time, who were the show itself. One of the things that stick out in my mind, I introduced the show, and I went out and I sat down at the end of the aisle right here, and next to me was my wife, and next to her was my secretary, and next to her was a young lady that we didn't know. And the young lady, after I sat down, she kept getting up and going out, coming back in, getting up and coming back in. And I had a secretary that didn't mince words. And so she told her, you can't do that. This is disturbing us. You can't do that. So the show starts. And in the middle of the show, Ricky Skaggs says, "Today is my wife's birthday. Will you stand up?" And that was his wife. So I remember that real well. I've been embarrassed ever since.
I had my time here. And during those years from 93 to 2007, yes, it was my place. But when I retired in July of 2007, it became somebody else's place. Merle and I had to learn to work together. There were times where we had differences of opinion, but we learned to work together, and she was a hard worker, bless her heart. Very talented artistically, and a good idea of what this building was supposed to do. She was the one that lined up a lot of the shows for our season. We had a group called the Producers Group, and they voted the shows, but she went out and it was a labor of love to come out and find all these performances that folks might like as part of a season. Very well done, and her heart was here in this building. I mean, it absolutely was, in terms of anything we were doing. I'm very fortunate to have had her, and she died unexpectedly, and that's still a big loss to this community.
Yeah, she was a force of nature when it came to the Paramount. Actually came to the area in 81, lived in Kingsport for the first 3 or 4 years, and got my MBA, and then got in the banking world. My first job was with Bank of Virginia, so then I moved to Bristol. And during that time, early 90s, I started doing some volunteer work with the Chamber and United Way, et cetera. And Merle was doing the same thing about that same time. So we ran into each other a lot. When she became marketing director, I don't know the exact year, about that time I joined the board at the Paramount, so I got to know her even a little better. And great person, very skilled at what she did, and also just fun to hang with. She was just really a super person. It's hard to put in words because she did most of that just through her presence and her influence, but she was such a great representative for the Paramount Center, and was always on the lookout for ways to communicate to the community and to to the Tri-Cities in terms of the value of the Paramount Center. And the thing I always liked, because of her background in the arts, she was very sensitive to the acts that came through. She was so supportive of them, making sure they got what they needed, make sure they were comfortable so they could do their best on stage. Merle, she was always doing things to try to make the community better, and particularly the Paramount Center. So by the time I had started painting a little bit, she was very encouraging to me, as a friend, and so we were talking about things to do, and we decided to do a fundraiser for the Paramount. And what we were going to do was host an art show, because nobody knew I was painting, and we thought, that would be kind of a draw. And then what we would do, we'd take $25 from everybody and put their name in a hat, and the winner would get a portrait. I'd paint the portrait, and that was going to be the fundraiser. And William King stepped up to the plate to host it at his beautiful haberdashery store. And so we really enjoyed planning that. And during that process, Merle said, "Hey, I want you to paint me sometime, warts and all, just, And then in that process, she passed away unexpectedly. I mean, everybody was in shock. And so William and I got together and decided to convert it to a tribute to Merle. And so I was out looking for images to paint of her, and somebody presented me with her presenting on stage. And it was a really nice image. My style, the documentary style, black and white, doesn't work in every situation, but boy, it did on that one. And so I was able to paint that, and then I gave the original to the family and made prints for everybody else. Of course, I kept a print for myself, and it's in my studio gallery. So when I have my coffee in the morning, not just Merle, but friends and family, I get to have my coffee with them every morning in the gallery.
So I came down for my first interview, and it was a Thursday night, and Theatre Bristol had one of their community theater productions on stage. So it was not a professional show. It was, they were doing Les Miserables, okay, the Broadway show. And it was all local townspeople. I stepped in, we saw a little bit of it, but then I was going out to dinner, and with one of the board members, and but what impressed me was, first of all, the caliber of the talent on stage, some great voices. The show looked really good on the stage. The house was packed on a Thursday night.
We did Fiddler on the Roof, and we did Les Mis. I had many people come to me. First of all, people who've been to Broadway shows, and they said that was Broadway caliber. And I think the Paramount lends to that, that they feel that, because it's a beautiful place. You get dressed up, you go out, and you don't have to get dressed up, but it's a fun night out. But also, I had so many people come up to me and say, if it weren't for you doing this, we would never see a show like this. And we really strive to create very high quality, excellent programs.
And not only that, when we left the place, the Paramount, and went down the street to, I think it was one of the restaurants there, every restaurant up and down State Street was also packed. And I thought, this town's got it going. You can park your car for free, you can go to see a show, you can go out to dinner before or afterwards, or both. And this could really be a destination. And that's the power of live entertainment.
And without the Paramount, we wouldn't see that, especially on a year-round basis. Our food and beverage-based businesses and retailers can always see an influx in their sales whenever there's a show at the Paramount.
The Paramount was really humming along. So I think the first 10 shows that we did in 2020, most of them were sold out. And
we're doing really well. And we had, I remember we had just booked Cody Jinks for one show. He sold out so quickly, we added a second. And we did that with a very short turnaround, like a 2-week turnaround before his performance, because it just popped up, and we were able to do that. So what happened was we got, you know, it all started to come down. I'm not sure even like who said that we had to do it, but it was pretty much that all of the artists were canceling their tours. Because you know what? I remember Joe Diffie passed. He died of COVID on the road. And also John Prine had just died. And the artists, you know, for them, they were most at risk because they're on these close quarters on their tour buses, and they're traveling from one big room full of people, one theater, packed theater, to another packed theater. So they just could not protect themselves from whatever this was that was starting to become so frightening. And we had to cancel 30 shows that we had in the pipeline, and within a couple of weeks it became clear that we were going to have to lay off most of the staff or put them on furlough. And the confusion that followed was the next year of my life, basically. It was a difficult time, not just because of how frightening the pandemic itself had become, but the impact it had on the economy, and nobody was buying a ticket. No, you just couldn't figure out anything. None of the standard rules applied anymore. And I thank goodness that the government stepped in, because honestly, if they hadn't, and looking backwards from the perspective of now when things are starting to come back, if they hadn't done what they'd done, there would be no live entertainment industry. At this point, most of the not-for-profits would not have been able to climb back, but the commercial industry would have been in tatters, would have been in shambles. Imagine what it would have been if we had allowed the entire industry to just crash. Yeah, it was a very challenging time. Paramount came through pretty good. We took advantage. The board got the board of directors was very good at making sure that we got our fair share of that PPP and SVOG money, and that really put the Paramount in a good position to emerge at the other end.
Paramount Bristol has always been a very significant part in my life, so even before I worked here, I was very familiar with the building and the venue. I was in the Sullivan East High School choir, and the first time I sang a solo on a big stage was on this stage. One of my very first dates with my husband was at a show here. When I was in radio, one of my biggest interviews, in-person interviews, happened with the Oak Ridge Boys right backstage. And so this building and the Paramount has been a part of my life my whole life. Being closed for the pandemic was kind of a blessing in disguise. You never want to be shut down for 17 months, but we really were able to take a negative and turn it into a positive, because it allowed us to do a lot of renovations and a lot of work that needed to happen. It was at that time a 90-year-old building, and so a lot of maintenance needs to happen, and so that really allowed us to get all of that work done. And as we decided to reopen, we really did a lot of publicity and a lot of work to try to make sure people knew we were back.
We were very fortunate in that period going into before COVID and during COVID that we had a couple of groups of Bristol's finest. I'm talking about the Blue Stocking Club, and then a whole nother group of people that Nancy DeFries assembled, and mainly women. And I often said, you want to get something done in that town, you ask the ladies. And it was true, because between Nell Beeger and her mom and all of the ladies in the Blue Stocking Club and Nancy DeFries and all of her friends of the Paramount She Formed group, we got all of the interior work taken care of. We got a whole new lighting system, and we got that roof fixed.
The biggest thing with any old historic building is climate control and basically keeping the elements out, keeping the inside stable. When there's water leaks or roof issues, or say there's a fluctuation in temperature that would happen, it could be any number of reasons. That is the biggest problem with historic buildings, is water infiltration is just very erosive and can cause extensive damage. And a lot of times, where there's so many decorative finishes here, you can almost get masks until it's almost to the point of no return. Keeping things solid, keeping climate the same, making sure the roof is secure, and that's the biggest thing to keeping old buildings, in better shape. And some of it is just wear and tear. You have a lot of people coming in, and unfortunately not everybody respects what it takes to restore and or upkeep a building like this. So, people are, something shiny, let's scratch it, and not understand what it takes to fix it, or just don't care. So that's a small part, but most of it is just keeping things stable.
We had a lot of moisture damage, and so I've seen plaster be repaired. I've seen scaffolding all over the building. I've seen chairs come in and out to make way for atrium lifts. I've seen stencils, some of the original stencils that were used to decorate the building in the 1991 renovation. We found those stencils, and they used them. You can see on the ceiling, the X pattern on the ceiling. We still have those stencils, and in between the border around the murals, those are still upstairs. And so that was really exciting to see some of that original work being used again 30 years later. And one of my favorite parts about the renovation is the repair of some of the gold leaf. There's a lot of gold leaf in here, and it's really fascinating when you see the gold leaf squares. They're about 5 by 5 squares, and so if you look around and see all the gold leaf in the building, and know that each one of those 5 by 5 squares had to be put on by hand and scraped with a paintbrush to sort of get it in there. It's really fascinating and tedious work, and was done with a lot of love and care and expert precision.
Company's Conrad Schmidt Studios. We're the oldest historic interior restoration company in the country. It was started in 1889 by Conrad Schmidt himself, and we are actually a third generation company. Originally, I kind of taught myself how to paint, and I did paintings in NASCAR, helmets for the drivers, and paintings for team owners and drivers. And travel schedule was hectic back then, and that was probably the late 90s. So I just kind of took a break from it, and I happened to live in the same area as the owner of the company. We had crossed paths, and he had seen some of my paintings, and I said, well, I could put you to work. I'm like, I don't know, maybe. And I called him about a month later, and well, now we're 20 years later. But to learn that, you almost have to just jump in. And a lot of it, if not all of it, is learned by working on site. There's no book, there's really not a school you can go to that's going to teach you how to do all of this, because we go through a marbleizing, faux stone, to gold leafing, all different types of processes. And I don't know of one particular place you can get that experience from without being on the job. So a lot of our techniques and stuff are passed down through the older gentlemen that used to work here and ladies that used to work here on down through the ranks. So I don't know, I kind of don't feel like I'm a senior, but I guess I am one of the seniors now.
One of my favorite stories is Mary Beth Raniero was a major part of spearheading the renovation in 1991. And so for the last 30 years, she said those sconces are upside down. When they rehung them, they're upside down. And so while we were closed down and doing some renovation work, we flipped them around, and Mary Beth was right. And so now the 3 sconces on either side of the wall are as they should be and how they were originally. But for 30 years, they were the wrong way.
There's 2 areas that you see that are all white, and those would be where the 2 go. They had some water damage behind them, and unfortunately it takes a toll on You introduce water to canvas, eventually it starts to break it down, and then it starts to come through the front, and then the paint starts to fail. So there was pretty extensive rework on those canvases. So once they're done, they'll be pristine, and then we'll reapply an adhesive and put them back up on the wall, and that should be good for about another 30, 40 years. That was the first thing I did when I got here, was remove the old murals, package them up, ship them back to the studio, because we knew that it was going to take at least 3 or 4 weeks to get those reworked and fixed. I was excited because the gold leaf that's in here, like primarily around the arches and the loge boxes and stuff, and even the fluted pilasters are variegated gold. And I've never had a chance to really work with variegated gold because it's very unique and it's not used in a lot of applications. So that would be the number one thing in this theater that really sets itself apart. There's a lot of silver leaf and gold leaf that we use in other places and stuff. But to prepare, just looking at pictures, kind of like, all right, let's throw all my tools in a toolbox, from marbleizing brushes to wood graining tools, ornamental plaster tools. You kind of just bring it all.
Now, there's a lot of upkeep and maintenance, but I think you have to look at that 2 ways. If these buildings are neglected and they get into disrepair, it's because you weren't spending small amounts of money all along. You weren't putting it in the budget, you weren't setting it aside, and you weren't doing the maintenance work that needed to be done. So when you have to raise $1 million to catch up with all of that, you have to get in your head that this is money we should have been spending all along. It's not cheap to keep them up, but it's not cheap to build a new one either. And there's that old saying, they don't make them like that anymore. They don't make them like the Paramount anymore.
It's amazing what a few $100,000 and some vision will do for you. First of all, backstage, we as travelers, traveling musicians and traveling theatrical troupes, people understand the best and the hardest of times out here on the road. It's not exactly like home when you travel. So to have a nice dressing room, a nice place to visit with people, to do meetings during the day, to have, food. And that's happened. That's always kind of been here. But this time I pulled it and went, wait a minute, somebody wrote a check. And it's really nice backstage. And then I look around this theater, that all the touch-ups that have been done, it just amplifies the beauty of it. So it's great.
They're away from home for weeks, sometimes months at a time, and they have no control. They don't have a vehicle that they can get around anytime they want to. They're really in your hands, and so it's important to take care of the artists when they're here, to make them feel comfortable, get them what they need, because that really translates to the performance on stage. And they don't ask for a lot. They just need some hot coffee and some good food. There have been several artists who have performed here and gone back and talked to their agents and talked about what a wonderful group of people that we have working here at the Paramount, and how well we took care of them, and how nice the building is. And those agents have in turn said, well, hey, we want to get some of our other artists on our roster here, and we're going to give you a break on pricing or whatever, give you whatever date you want, because they want to play at the Paramount. And part of that is because this historic building, but a major part of it, I think the biggest part, is how we treat them.
Well, I think that whole tradition and that that moniker of being the birthplace of country music is where we all started from. You have the museum, you have that tradition, and all the great artists who made such a huge global impact on what American music is, started in Bristol. And naturally we leaned on a lot of country artists to fill the calendar, the Marty Stewarts, and just the list of people we had coming through there, and who still do. I mean, always have. It's the Paramount Bristol is recognized as a important venue for country music acts, and all the artists know it and want to play it.
I love Bristol. It's just one of those spiritual stops along the way for me. I come here and I leave energized, refreshed, reminded of my mission, reminded of the overall picture of why I do these things. I'm grateful that I have a job because my job started here in Bristol back in the 20s. I've seen Bristol in a lot of incarnations. And I've seen Bristol when you could shoot a cannonball down the middle of the street on a Saturday at times and hit nobody. And then here comes Rhythm and Roots and the birthplace of Country Music Museum and one thing after another. And all of a sudden, Bristol is on fire again, and it's an exemplary city for people that, you know, need encouragement to know that it can happen to their town too. So there's a lot going on in Bristol that I'd love to be a part of.
As a child, my father was a huge country music fan, and so not only would he play country music, but he would inspire me. I would read about it, but even more than that, we had a tape collection, some tape cassettes that would talk about the history of country music. One of them was called Lee Cash's 50 Golden Years of Country Music. And in between songs, it would do bumpers where it explained who it was that this music came from and where it was this music came from. And you better believe they talked about Bristol and how A.P. Carter met Ralph Peer and said that we're going to record the Carter family. We're going to record Jimmy Rogers. It really does my heart good to pull into this town and to see the respect and the honor that that's given. In what seems to me a very heartfelt and classy way, including this incredible theater as a venue. Can you imagine if Bristol didn't have a place to play country music in the heart of it like this? It is the birthplace of country music. If there's no Bristol, there's no Nashville in my mind.
Any building must have a foundation. And if you don't have that good foundation, solid knowing where you came from, then you really don't know where you're going if you don't know where you came from. And that is another thing I'm so proud about this area for, is accepting of different styles of music that really branches out from that original thing.
It's not just country music in Bristol. The audience in East Tennessee really likes its classic rock, and will come out for jazz, and will come out for, they'll come out for the Nutcracker and the Moscow Ballet, and their game. They will come out for anything that's of a high quality. It's a discerning audience, and if you treat them right, they will show up, and the enthusiasm is there. I never felt like there was something we couldn't put up at the Paramount because the audience wouldn't respond.
I won tickets to see Dave Mason here, and that was an awesome show. I'm a big fan of Bela Fleck and the Flecktones.
We just came this spring and saw the Mavericks. That was probably one of the best shows I've seen in a long time.
I saw Johnny Winter here. I saw 38 Special here.
The 38 Special, which I don't know who they are, but they were a group, a band. And my kids, I said, oh, they're going to have the 38. My kids said, oh, Mom, the place is going to be ruined. It's going to be ruined. I said, why? And said, well, the minute the lights go out, they're going to light up. I said, oh, my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. That is not going to happen. So I came down here. You know, they didn't do anything. They were so good. I think you put people in a beautiful place, and most everybody will take care of it. I think they appreciate it.
You're never going to please 100% of the people 100% of the time, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, and we definitely do. We want to have things on the Paramount Bristol stage that appeal locally and nationally, and we put a lot of effort into that. This is the community's theater, and so we work with a lot of organizations, local organizations like Theater Bristol and Bristol Ballet and Mountain Empire Children's Choral Academy, Symphony of the Mountains. We really want our local arts community to know that we are here to support them.
It's a fact that every person who walks through the door at the Paramount to see a show, in addition to what they paid for their ticket, is spending an additional $30 to $40 in the local community. The arts are not just a nicety for the community, they are actually something worth investing in terms of long-term economic impact.
The renovation had to be the catalyst that kind of started
redevelopment in downtown Bristol.
When the Paramount really came back to life is when downtown came back to life. It encouraged the economic growth that we continue to see in downtown Bristol today. And we really have the Paramount to thank for that.
But the town, you know, the town was ready in the first place because the town had enough going on all by itself that the Paramount could have that impact.
We have something here that you have to drive or fly quite a distance to see anything like it. So the Paramount is really special.
The Paramount is like that crown jewel on our State Street, wonderful State Street. You know, the marquee and everything outside, it just says Bristol.
The theater was beautiful then, I thought. They did a tremendous job, but it's never been more beautiful than it is right now.
It's not just movies, not just music, not just plays. It's a variety of everything I think they can imagine to do to get the audiences here, and they succeed.
It's just a flood. It's a flood of memories. It makes my heart flutter.
Precious memories, precious memories.
Well, I think, the Paramount's been one of my favorite places to play. Personally, it's really important to me that we hang on to places like this. These days of everything just being a kind of brick and mortar, four walls and just some chairs, it doesn't have the feel that you get. Like when you perform at a place like the Paramount, you kind of get the feeling of the building. And, you know, this is history. You know, we can't forget that. And I worry sometimes that across the country we're losing great theaters like this because everybody wants to put in a parking lot or they want to do, you know, apartment buildings or whatever. And to lose something like this, I mean, to look around at the walls and, you know, see still some of the original mortar and stuff, you can't tear that down. I mean, this was a place that was a part of people's lives and still is. We have to really be careful about what we're willing to give up in the name of progress. There has to be people within the community that step up and go, no, we cannot lose a place like this. Because once it's gone, it's gone. You can't rebuild the Paramount. You know, you can build a building and call it the Paramount, but you can't recreate the Paramount. And then all of a sudden somebody goes, well, I wish we had that back. And you can't get it back.
I'm not here to tell anybody what to do, but if I lived in or around Bristol, I would be back here again and again. It's a beautiful thing, and to not take advantage of it would be a real shame. And to not support it so that your children and the future generations of Bristol, you don't want to be the generation that drops the baton, and that for almost 100 years we knew how important Bristol was, and then this group of people forgot. You don't want to be that group. So come support this. Come on out, hear the people you love in a venue where you can listen on the radio all day long or go to big concerts and, you know, in the bigger cities. You're going to have a moment here with them that you won't forget.
I think the arts are essential. I do. And music and art can work as healers and arbitrators, and when nothing else will sometimes. You know, even if but for a moment, the healing power of music can unify people, and then they can go back to their differences. But for a minute, you know, we all agreed on that particular song or that particular performance. And this old house here, you know, it goes back to the vaudeville days. And when times come, everything ebbs and flows and everything changes. But when times come, then the lights get dim here. Basically, all you have to do is go back to the blueprint of what it was meant to be in the first place. Wait for a new generation of believers. Get a little more money to pump it back up and some believers. And then magic happens again. And so that's what the Paramount, you know, that should be on the marquee every night. Magic happens here. And it does.
You know, I've been here, my wife and I have come to several things over the years here, whether it's a theater or a musical act that's been presented or whatever it might be. And I don't know, there's just that excitement, just that it feels like, for lack of a better word, sort of feels like home. You know, it feels it's very comfortable. I have a sense of, I don't want to say ownership, but investment. I feel like part of me is invested in this place. And so when I come in here, I feel sort of like home.
I sit here and I just think it's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful place that I am so proud that the community is using. And it is the community's building because they have paid for it and they are attending. If you have a building and nobody comes, it's no good. We are so fortunate. You know, you go through bad years. The 80s were, you know, scary years, and it was a scary time to start all of this. But I think it is absolutely beautiful. I really do. I still wonder at the beauty of it all, the colors, the calmness. The Paramount is a dream.